Tarleton's quarter. Within weeks of the summer of 1780, those two words were spreading through the Carolina backcountry faster than any British order of march could follow. They meant something specific and brutal. No surrender accepted, no mercy given, no quarter. They were not a compliment. They were a warning about what to expect if a certain lieutenant colonel of British cavalry caught up with you, and they became something else too. Something the officer who inspired them could never have anticipated. They became a recruiting slogan. By the autumn of 1780, men who had been sitting out the war in the western mountains of the Carolinas, men who had no particular interest in politics or independence, were picking up their rifles because of what those two words meant and marching east to settle a personal account with the British Army. The officer who gave them that phrase was 25 years old at the time, barely a year into the most lethal campaign of the entire Revolutionary War, and completely convinced he was winning. His name was Banastre Tarleton, and no British officer in the war generated more fear, more rage, and ultimately more damage to the British cause than he did. Not through defeat, but through victory. Banastre Tarleton was born in Liverpool in 1754, the fourth son of a successful merchant family that had made its money in trade and local politics. His father served as mayor of Liverpool, a position of genuine civic standing at a port city that was by the middle of the 18th century one of the wealthiest in Britain, its prosperity built in no small part on the transatlantic slave trade. The family was prosperous enough to send Banastre to Oxford and then to the Middle Temple in London to study law, which he did briefly and apparently without much conviction before blowing through a substantial chunk of his inheritance on gambling and whatever other pleasures London offered a young man of means and no particular discipline. In April of 1775, with his finances in considerable disorder and a war just starting in the American colonies, his mother purchased him a commission as a cornet in the 1st Dragoon Guards. Tarleton was 20 years old, had no military experience whatsoever, and was sailing to North America within months. Within 18 months, he would be one of the most talked about cavalry officers in the British Army. The event that first made his name came in December of 1776, when American General Charles Lee, one of Washington's senior commanders and widely considered among the ablest officers in the Continental Army, was captured at a tavern in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, while still in his nightclothes and dressing gown, having stayed behind with a small escort when the main army moved on. Tarleton led the patrol of dragoons that surrounded the building and pulled Lee out. It was a militarily embarrassing capture for the Americans, a senior general taken through carelessness rather than battle, his professional dignity rather thoroughly destroyed by the manner of his arrest, and it made Tarleton's reputation in British officer circles almost immediately. He was 22 years old and had just bagged a major general. Whatever his superiors had previously thought of this young cavalry cornet with the gambling debts and the Oxford degree, they were paying close attention now. By 1780, Tarleton commanded the British Legion, a mixed unit of cavalry and mounted infantry, recruited primarily from American loyalists, and sailed south with the expedition that laid siege to Charleston, South Carolina. He performed brilliantly in the preliminary operations around the city, routing American cavalry at Monk's Corner in a pre-dawn attack on April 14th, and then routing them again at Lanud's Ferry weeks later, cutting off every escape route from Charleston before it fell. The speed and aggression of his strikes in those early operations established a pattern that Cornwallis came to rely on. Tarleton was the officer you sent when you needed something done quickly and completely, without too many questions about method. Charleston surrendered on May 12, 1780, delivering more than 5,000 Continental soldiers into British captivity in a single stroke, the worst American defeat of the entire war. With the Southern Continental Army effectively destroyed, Cornwallis tasked Tarleton with chasing down and finishing off whatever remnants remained in the field. It was the perfect assignment for a cavalry commander of his temperament and his record, and the first mission he was given produced the event that would define the rest of his life. Colonel Abraham Buford was moving north toward North Carolina with around 350 Virginia Continentals, the last organized Continental force left in the state, when Tarleton set out after him on May 27th. Tarleton covered more than 100 miles in 54 hours, his column eating through horses and pressing his men to the edge of their endurance. He caught Buford in a farming region near the South Carolina border called the Waxhaws on May 29th. Tarleton sent a flag of truce ahead with a demand for surrender, writing to Buford that resistance was vain and that he was making an offer that could never be repeated. Buford refused. What happened next has been debated by historians for 2.5 centuries, and the honest account has to carry that uncertainty rather than dismiss it. Tarleton's cavalry attacked Buford's infantry in the open field and tore through them in minutes. During the charge, Tarleton's horse was shot out from under him, and he was pinned beneath the animal for a period of the fighting. According to Tarleton's own account, his men, believing their colonel had been killed, flew into a rage and continued cutting down soldiers who were attempting to lay down their arms. According to American accounts gathered in the aftermath, the slaughter was deliberate and systematic, carried out with full awareness that men were surrendering. What both sides agree on is the outcome. 113 Americans were killed on the field. Another 150 were so badly wounded they could not be moved and had to be left behind on parole. 53 prisoners were taken. British losses were 5 killed and 12 wounded. Tarleton had destroyed a Continental regiment in under an hour, and the wounded who could not march were carried to nearby churches by local families who tended them through the following weeks, among them a 13-year-old boy from the Waxhaws region named Andrew Jackson, who would remember what he saw there for the rest of his life. Whether the killing of men trying to surrender was ordered, permitted, or simply unstoppable in the chaos, Tarleton's name would be permanently attached to it. The phrase Tarleton's quarter spread immediately. It meant what it said. If you were fighting Tarleton's men and the battle turned against you, throwing down your weapon was no guarantee of survival. This was not just propaganda, and it was not merely an abstract grievance among patriots already committed to the fight. It changed the behavior of actual soldiers in actual battles going forward, and it reached men who had previously been sitting on the fence. At Kings Mountain in October of 1780, a largely American loyalist force under British Major Patrick Ferguson was overrun by militia from the western settlements, men who had crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains specifically in response to what they had heard about British conduct in the Carolina backcountry. The accounts that had reached them over the summer included not just Waxhaws, but a string of farm burnings, property confiscations, and civilian abuses carried out by various British and Loyalist forces operating across the region. When Ferguson's surviving men tried to surrender, the militia killed a significant number of them before their officers could restore order. The phrase those militia shouted as they attacked was Tarleton's quarter and Remember Buford, Ferguson's Loyalist soldiers dying in part because of what Tarleton had done 5 months and more than 100 miles away. Tarleton did not fight at Kings Mountain, but his reputation was present on that hillside, doing its work. The same dynamic played out when Tarleton was sent to destroy Francis Marion's militia in the swamps of the Petee region. Cornwallis ordered him to deal with the problem Marion represented, and Tarleton pursued him through 26 miles of swamp country before concluding, famously, that no military force could follow him further into that terrain. Marion's ability to maintain a functioning resistance in the Carolinas depended entirely on a local population willing to feed his men, shelter them, and carry intelligence about British movements, and that population was far more willing to take those risks after Waxhaws than it would have been before. Tarleton's brutality did not suppress resistance in South Carolina. It grew it. The same pattern repeated when Tarleton turned to civilian property. Unable to catch the militia commanders who continued harassing British supply lines and outposts, Tarleton and officers operating under him began burning farms and destroying crops across large areas of the countryside, punishing civilian populations suspected of harboring or supporting the Patriot cause. This was a deliberate strategic choice, not a breakdown of discipline, but an explicit extension of the same logic that had worked so well at Waxhaws: apply sufficient force and the opposition would fold. It was also, by the assessment of Cornwallis himself, a strategic failure that he began to recognize too late. Rather than breaking the population's will to resist, the destruction of their property gave neutral farmers a personal stake in seeing the British gone. A man whose farm had not burned had reasons to weigh his risks carefully before sheltering a militia patrol. A man whose farm had burned had already paid the cost and had no comparable reason for restraint going forward. The men who watched their fields destroyed had no particular reason to be moderate about what they did next. By the winter of 1780 and 1781, Tarleton had accumulated an unbroken string of battlefield victories, and within the British Army his reputation remained largely intact. He was aggressive, fast, and almost always successful in direct engagements. But the campaign as a whole was producing exactly the opposite of its intended effect. The more aggressively the British pursued the militia, the more the militia found ways to avoid open engagement and hit back at supply lines and isolated posts instead. Washington himself sent one of his most capable officers, Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, south with a specific assignment: find Tarleton and deal with him. Morgan chose a piece of open ground in the South Carolina backcountry called Cowpens, positioned his force carefully, and waited. He had one particular tool that no British commander could duplicate and no order of battle could replicate. His militia were terrified of Tarleton. They had been living under his shadow for months, hearing the accounts from the Waxhaws, watching what happened to farms that sheltered Patriot soldiers. And Morgan found a way to turn that terror into a tactical weapon. The standard problem with militia and set-piece battles was that they broke when professional infantry advanced on them with bayonets, and there was nothing a commander could reliably do to prevent it short of placing his own soldiers behind them with orders to shoot anyone who ran. Morgan's insight was to use that inevitable retreat as a design feature rather than a flaw. He positioned his riflemen and militia in forward lines with explicit instructions to fire 2 or 3 volleys and then fall back, not in panic, but in a controlled withdrawal that would look to the advancing British exactly like a collapsing line. Continental regulars waited on the ridge behind them. Cavalry, under Colonel William Washington, waited concealed on the flanks. Morgan, by most accounts, spent the night before the battle moving through his camp personally, talking to his men, telling them he only needed 2 good shots and then they could run, and reminding his militia what Tarleton had done at the Waxhaws. The last part was, tactically speaking, the most important thing, he said. Men who believed surrendering to Tarleton's cavalry meant being cut down anyway had a strong incentive to keep fighting rather than bolt. Morgan had stripped his militia's most reliable escape option out of the equation simply by putting Tarleton's name in their heads the night before the battle. On the morning of January 17, 1781, Tarleton drove his exhausted column onto the Cowpens ground and attacked without waiting to reconnoiter or rest his men properly. He had been pushing his legion hard for days, fording swollen rivers and driving through wet, cold weather to catch Morgan before he could cross the broad river to safety. Speed was Tarleton's signature move. This time, it brought him to battle on the enemy's terms rather than his own. His advance infantry drove the first line of American riflemen back exactly as expected. They drove the second line of militia back exactly as expected. Then they ran into the Continental line on the ridge, which was not falling back at all, and the British advance stalled under disciplined musket fire at close range. A miscommunication during the fight caused part of the British right flank to begin wheeling, which nearby troops interpreted as a retreat and began to mirror, and what had been an advancing British line suddenly looked, from within, like a collapsing one. The American cavalry hit both flanks simultaneously. In the resulting chaos, the British infantry did what Tarleton's militia had done for months. They broke. Tarleton tried to rally his cavalry for a countercharge. Most of them refused to follow him into what was clearly a lost position. He led the 54 men who did stay into a brief, violent skirmish with Colonel William Washington's dragoons, nearly being cut down personally before breaking off and fleeing east. He left behind 110 men killed and 712 captured, 200 of them too badly wounded to march. 86% of his force destroyed in roughly an hour on a field he had chosen to attack without preparation against an enemy who had been setting the trap for days. In his memoirs, Tarleton credited American bravery for the result while simultaneously blaming his own cavalry for refusing to charge, leaving himself conspicuously absent from the accounting of what had gone wrong. Tarleton returned to Britain in 1782, arrived initially to some public celebration, had his portrait painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds in a green uniform with a plume-helmeted cap under his arm. The image of a dashing young cavalry officer rather than the man whose name had become a verb for massacre in the American South. Within a few years he was sitting in Parliament as a member for Liverpool, the same city his father had once served as mayor. The same city that had grown wealthy on the slave trade his family had profited from. He served in Parliament, with one brief gap, from 1790 until 1812, where he became known among other things for his vigorous and repeated defense of the slave trade against the growing abolitionist movement that was pressing Parliament to end it, arguing in floor speeches that abolition would ruin British commerce and that the trade was a necessary pillar of the empire's economy. He lobbied repeatedly for a combat command during the Napoleonic Wars and was turned down every time, the army apparently unconvinced that the qualities that had made him devastating against Carolina militia translated to the very different demands of European campaign command. He was eventually made a baronet in 1815 and a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of Bath in 1820. He died in 1833 at 78. The Americans had formed their opinion of him somewhat earlier and more permanently. At the Yorktown surrender ceremony in October 1781, as British and American officers sat down for the ceremonial dinner that followed a formal capitulation, the invitation list did not include Tarleton. The American officers made clear he was not welcome at their table. Whatever conventions around military courtesies between professional adversaries might normally have required, the men who had spent 2 years in the field against the British Legion in the Carolinas had made a specific and deliberate exception for the officer who commanded it. It was a small moment, a dinner table, rather than a battlefield, but it was unambiguous. Tarleton was excluded not because of defeat, but because of how he had won. The portrait by Reynolds is still at the National Gallery in London, a young officer in green and black with a swagger that the canvas cannot quite contain. But the phrase he left behind outlasted the portrait, outlasted Parliament, outlasted the campaign itself. Tarleton's Quarter. It meant something precise about one man's conduct in one summer, and it ended up shaping battles he never fought, rallying men against him who had never met him, and contributing directly to the collapse of a British strategy he had done more than almost anyone to advance. That is the final irony of Banastre Tarleton's war. He was genuinely one of the most capable cavalry commanders the British produced in the entire conflict, fast and decisive and willing to drive himself and his men further than any opponent expected. He won nearly everything he touched through most of 1780, and in winning the way he won, he handed the American cause something more valuable than any single battlefield victory. He handed it a cause of outrage that recruited men, sustained militia resistance, and ultimately helped produce the chain of events that ended the British Army's hold on the southern colonies for good. If you enjoyed this story, go ahead and hit subscribe below.